Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Interlink Podcast, an initiative under the Center for New Economic Studies at Open Global University. Interlink aims to hold nuanced conversations on the interdisciplinary nature of problems plaguing the world today. As we hold conversations on the socio-political climate, we want to break down these intellectual barriers and look at topics in a way that allows us to question them from several facets. If you're listening to our podcast for the first time, please do have a look at our previous works as well. We are very delighted to have with us today Ms. Prachi Hutta, a lecturer at Office of Interdisciplinary Studies at Open Global University, Solipur. With several publications under her name, she writes on gender, society, and governance in Haryana. One such publication is Khap Panchayats in Transition, issue dated June, published in the renowned Economic and Political Weekly. We truly appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we will discuss Khap Panchayats, the traditional caste-based councils of North India that continue to stir debate at this intersection of custom, law, and social justice. So, with that, we move on to our first question, which is in the light of 2018 Shakti Vahini judgment, how effective have state governments been in curbing illegal actions by Khap Panchayats, especially regarding the honor killings and marriage restrictions?
Yeah. Hi. Firstly, thank you for having me. And going back to your question, so the Shakti Vahini judgment is a very widely talked about judgment because it categorically declared that Khap Panchayats have no authority to sanction honor killings or impose restrictions on intercaste marriages and so on. So the Supreme Court issued comprehensive guidelines asking state governments to take very proactive measures to curb such practices. In response, several states did take some steps to implement these directives. So, for instance, we had Maharashtra that issued a government resolution in late in 2022, mandating police stations to remain vigilant regarding intercaste marriages and to take actions against any such unlawful gatherings by any such caste councils or panchayats. The resolution also emphasized the need for rapid response teams and having 24-hour helplines to assist couples facing threats. So a lot of state governments have implemented such things, have issued come up with such directives, issued such things. However, the effectiveness of these measures always remains very debatable. Despite the legal framework, such panchayats continue to exert very degree of influence, especially in rural areas. Though the degree and extent of such influence has gone down, very visibly with changing times. Again, the implementation of these guidelines has been very inconsistent across states. So while some states have special cells to address grievances related to honor-based violence, others have shown a lot of reluctance or delayed action. So we have the case of Uttar Pradesh, which reported basically no cases of honor killings between the 2 years of 2010 and 2012. Yet, it continued to receive directives from the Supreme Court to monitor such panchayat diktats. So that's that. But the judicial approach, though progressive, again, I mean, it's very natural that it faces challenges when it's to be translated on ground into tangible outcomes. So that's always the case. And that's mainly because of the, persistence of deeply ingrained cultural norms and the lack of robust enforcement institutions or mechanisms. So without sustained political will and community engagement, such directives, may remain largely symbolic.
Yes, that's completely true. States like Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, while they have implemented, but they have failed in a way to fully operationalize protective measures such as safe houses and special cells, allowing interference in personal liberty to just persist in practice. So with that, moving on to our next question. With the Mediation Act 2023 passed to promote out-of-court settlements, should Khap Panchayats be recognized as grassroots mediators? And if yes, what safeguards must be put in place?
So, as you just said, that the very aim of this mediation act is to promote out of court settlements and, by providing a very structured framework for this entire process. So while it basically involves empowering communities through alternative dispute resolution, the inclusion of, say, these institutions like hubs as formal mediators might not be very appropriate. These are informal bodies without any legal authority. And in the judgment, the Shakti Vaini judgment that we were just talking about, the Supreme Court had very explicitly stated that these panchayats cannot assume the role of law enforcement agencies. Their interference in matters like marriage between consenting adults was called absolutely illegal. So integrating them into formal mediation processes would then become very contradictory. Plus, they have a history of enforcing patriarchal norms that's very widely known, particularly when it comes to marriages, say, marriage, inheritance, and social conduct. So, however, their outlook has relatively changed over time now. We have a lot of instances, where these Khaps have taken quote unquote progressive measures. Say the Bura Khap unanimously decided to not accept dowry and keep the marriage expenditure, within its villages very minimal, and also focus on girls' educations. And this decision was also adopted in all its 84 villages. We also had a similar thing done by Satrol Khap, which is the largest khap in Haryana. It allowed intercaste marriages relatively early, yeah, probably a decade or so ago. And people, it also allowed people of its different villages to intermarry. So it's something that's not considered very appropriate when it comes to rural Haryana's social milieu. But I mean, they've come up with these things, but in most cases these continue to be, these institutions continue to be dominated by men, though some caps have women's cells or women's wings, but it's very few. So these are dominated primarily by men. So that's another issue, gender, caste, and I mean, these are certain issues that make it not very appropriate to have these as formal mediators.
Agreed. I feel couple chats can only be recognized as community mediators only if subject to strict safeguards, oversight mechanisms, and especially gender sensitization training and non-binding decisions, and specifically exclusion from cases which are involving fundamental rights like marriage and bodily autonomy. So, with that, moving on to our next question. Can the growing legal recognition of alternative dispute resolution methods unintentionally allow repressive institutions like CUPS to gain legitimacy without undergoing reform?
So, while ADR can definitely democratize access to justice, it must not become a backdoor for, customary bodies, in this case, CAPs, to evade necessary reforms. And some of what you had just mentioned, especially regarding gender and caste equity. So again, while some recent actions, such as say supporting women's protests against, women wrestlers' protests against sexual harassment, so these suggest a shift towards more progressive engagements. Despite this, there is a very real, tangible risk that it might allow regressive practices to persist under the guise of legitimate dispute resolution, these mechanisms. So some of the points that you've already mentioned, there has to be certain criteria in order to, allow them to be a part of this process. So I definitely agree. I mean, that was pretty comprehensive, the pointers that you mentioned. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely right. I mean, there's always a risk that ADR could cloak cups with legitimacy if not accompanied by reform. And without legal scrutiny and structural accountability, ADR may become a conduit for reinforcing caste hierarchies and patriarchal norms in itself. So, this ties us with our next question, which says, how should we interpret CUP support for the 2023 wrestlers' protest against sexual harassment? And is this a turning point in rural gender politics or a selective stance to maintain public credibility?
So it is said that traditionally CAPs have enforced strict patriarchal norms, right, regulating marriage, sexuality, often in ways that conflict with constitutional values. So their intervention in the wrestlers' protest thus seems like a departure there. It also reflects the evolving relationship between traditional authority and the modern state. If we look at it through the concept of legal pluralism, where CAPs are seeking to regain legitimacy by aligning themselves with popular justice oriented causes. especially as the state itself appeared, unresponsive to the protesters' demand. And this is something very similar to what happened during the farmers' protest as well. So we have, ways in which these traditional bodies are asking for accountability from the more democratic, modern state, which the latter seems to be evading in these cases. But the CARB support is also very context dependent and may be influenced by broader socio-economic pressures. I mean, the region is going through a lot of different kinds of, distresses. So we have agrarian distress. There's a lot of, increased unemployment, and also the growing prominence of women in sports. I mean, it's a phenomenon that's already been happening and been unraveling through the last couple of decades. So these push these institutions to adapt. These changes are often pragmatic responses to changing social realities, and it is also pretty selective. So, when it comes to other areas of women's lives, such as marriage and inheritance, the thinking hasn't radically changed. So, we have certain CARBs that have come up with certain progressive things when it comes to marriages. We are allowing intercaste marriages and across region marriages. It's fine. But again, I mean, those are that's a phenomenon that's already been taking place, and that too because of certain, because of the social cultural backdrop. I mean, we have a poor sex ratio in the state for God knows how long. I mean, it's been so long. It improved, but it's even the improvement is so little. How do you see that? So rather than calling this support a definitive turning point, it rather reflects the complex, negotiated process of legal pluralism and the incremental and often selective adaptation of patriarchal institutions under social or political pressures.
Agreed. And we can just say that it appears, I mean, after all, it appears more of a strategic move to retain relevance and public credibility rather than a genuine shift because, after all, Cups have supported national icons, but they have not really altered their stance on gender roles or caste-based control over women's autonomy. So it's quite a paradox in that way. With that, moving on to our next question. What explains the contradiction between Cups felicitating women athletes and simultaneously upholding these patriarchal controls over marriage and sexuality? And given your experience in this field, have you experienced and observed this tension between empowerment and private restrictions? And in this way, could you share some anecdotes that we haven't really noticed and we don't really get from articles, but something from your experience?
Yeah, so this duality is, I mean, it's very evidently rooted in this interplay between changing socio-economic realities and the persistence of deeply embedded patriarchal norms. So, on the one hand, the rise of women in sports has been celebrated by CARPs and different community, organizations who now publicly honor these, female athletes and even support their demands for justice. Again, as seen in the 2023 wrestlers' protest against sexual harassment. But this shift to just reiterate, it's partly pragmatic because the region faces, great in distress, limited job opportunities, and all of this has made women's sports a source of collective pride and also a newer avenue for social mobility. So sports is thus seen very differently now. However, this public empowerment does not necessarily or always extend to the private sphere. So while some CARPs have revised this stance when it comes to say intercaste marriage, there continues to be certain community or family backed, if not necessarily CARP backed controls over marriage, sexuality, and inheritance, upholding caste endogamy and patriarchal codes that restrict women's autonomy. So this tension between public empowerment and private restriction is not unique to Haryana either. I mean, similar patterns are observed in, mostly all other patriarchal societies where women's participation in public life is encouraged for collective benefit, but their personal freedoms remain tightly regulated. So I can think of one such instance that you ask now that you mentioned. I mean, during my field work, it was done when I was in Rohtak. So I was talking to these young female athletes who were teenagers and had been. I remember this girl was involved in kushti, And I was talking to her and other female members of her family, just, ki if they're getting so much encouragement for sports, I mean, even within family or, community as well, the wider community. So how does it translate to other spheres of these women's lives as well? And marriage becomes a very central issue there, right? Because of all the controls on marriage that we've always had in the region is caste based, and that within caste, there's so many other, norms that need to be, followed. So I just asked Ki because the Khap people were saying that now intercaste marriages, like, it's all right, it's working, we're okay with it, we have come up with new things, and they also gave me certain examples of in this event we talked about intercaste marriages and that it's all fine, like, we are okay with it. So when I talk to these younger women and I ask, can you marry on your own? I mean, it's not even about like marrying outside caste, but can you take a decision on something like this on your own? And it was like it was a big no. And then when it comes to intercaste marriage, it's like ye sochne ke bhi bahar hai. I mean, it's something that can't even be thought of. So what is said, I mean, the rhetoric and what actually, how women live their lives, it's pretty different that way. So empowerment in one sphere is not necessarily also transferring or entering into other spheres of their lives, especially marriage. So I could think of that. And there's also a lot of other such instances, that I especially experienced during, my field visits. It just sort of encapsulates most of what I heard from other women. So yeah.
I mean, this is very true. And as you said that it's not unique to Haryana, but I would say that, but would you agree that it's particularly just common in rural contexts in general that, again, just paraphrasing what you said before, that where honor is collective, individual freedom is selectively granted. And I mean, yeah, that's something there. So, can decentralization and grassroots democracy be meaningfully strengthened without confronting informal power, which is wielded by institutions like Khap Panchayats?
Uh, so I think the question I mean, any answer to this question must start with a basic clarification, and that I again go to the conceptual framework of legal pluralism, right? That power or law is not always state backed. Yeah, it emanates from different sources within society as well. So there's this constant interaction between the state and the society, and it's not unidirectional, it flows different ways. So also in some ways very Foucaultian, how power is just dispersed everywhere rather than it being, very structured or flowing in one direction. So while something like a CAP is more, I mean, it's basically non-state backed law, right? What they are trying to cover, we always implement or come up with or revise. And the intent of the state to influence something like this, some institution or non-state or extra constitutional institutions like CAPS, it's not very simple because again, I mean, there's always some kind of retaliation or resistance on the part of the latter as well whenever they are, the former tries to curtail their powers or control them or even reform them in some ways. Having democracy at the grassroots, like taking the case of, say, Gram Panchayats and its coexistence with certain institutions like, say, Khaps. I mean, there's always this constant interaction between the two. So, I mean, believing that, the existence of the latter should it really exist in a structure that is more that ideally ought to be bound by the former. I think that's very normative in some ways because I mean society has its own has its own ways of working. Communities, different communities, and I mean caste councils. It's not just in one part of the country. I mean, different areas have different names for these. So what we might call khaps here, kangaroo courts are all also there in Bengal or in Maharashtra, and we have all these, very dreadful news coming up when it comes to say intercaste marriages or women's autonomy over their sexuality and everything. So, I mean, the community has its own certain ways of regulating itself, and khap it's not always a very top down structure, right? There is what we call bhaichara in Haryana, and that is what rural Haryana is based on. So it's not that bhaichara is implemented because there are these larger institutions called khaps and they are ensuring that we follow it. It's something so deeply ingrained in our everyday lives, in the way we interact. especially in rural Haryana, that you don't require a khap in order to maintain this bhaichara. I mean, bhaichara is pivotal. This is what everything else is based on. The very existence of khaps, or the norms that we follow in our everyday. So this would always exist, even if there's a khap or not. And Khaps, I mean, it's not always like every action is based on what these Khaps are wanting us to do. So when we say that, women's autonomy in their private lives, it's at times it's more family backed or community backed, like the community, like literally that's around you. So those are these institutions that sanction what you're doing, rather than always thinking about a Khap that, a Khap might give a diktat and might get Saul killed. That might happen, but it's more nearer that, and that is how this bhaichara thing works, like, so again, I mean, ideally, yes, a lot of it must be curtailed, especially when it comes to hindering people's constitutional values, that I mean, the values that we are guaranteed by the constitution, certain rights, uh, but I mean, that's normative, and that's not how I mean, I don't see it going away. Like, its influence is fading, but it might not go away anytime soon. And yeah, I mean, and that is how this constant interaction between the state and society, the state even at the lowest levels, that it's experienced, that it's always contentious, it's more complex, and that's how it just goes on in different ways though.
Agreed. So maybe we can just say that rather than direct confrontation that can trigger more backlash in tightly knit rural communities, a more strategic approach could be just strengthening the formal institutions that promote local awareness and just increase the representation of marginalized groups in general. It could be women and Dalits within the formally structured panchayat system. And then over time, as these state-backed institutions become more responsive and efficient, we can just hope that the relevance and influence of Khap panchayats, which negatively impacts the communities, would naturally diminish.
Yeah.
Uh, and with that, we come to the end of the podcast. This has been a really insightful discussion, and thank you so much for taking out your time.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Gitali.
Thank you.